Every passing day, more and more Americans might just be rejecting the US's top political parties. A new Gallup survey says that young adults in the United States of America are inclined to support the Democrats or the Republicans. In fact, according to this survey, just under 45% of American adults now identify as independents. Over half of Generation Z or Gen Z and the millennials identify as political independents, while a majority of older generations side with a party. Data shows this is a substantial shift from 20 years ago, when closer to one-third of Americans said that they did not identify with the Democrats or Republicans. Gallup's analysis says that the young adults appears to be increasingly unhappy with the party, that is, the Republicans in power. That's a dynamic that could be good for the Democrats in this year's midterm elections, but doesn't promise lasting loyalty. In the last 15 years, the number of independents have increased significantly, and this year the Democrats gained the partisanship edge. According to the survey, nearly half, 47% of U.S. adults now identify as Democrats or lean toward the Democratic Party, while 42% are Republicans or they lean Republican. More independents have described their political views as moderate over the last decade, while Democrats and Republicans have grown less likely to identify as moderates. So the edge that Republicans had when Joe Biden was in power has worn off. About 47% of the independents called themselves moderates in 2025, as compared to about 3 in 10 Democrats and 2 in 10 Republicans. This creates another challenge for the parties to contend with, since appeals to the center to win the growing pool of independents could risk alienating the most committed people in their bases.
Hello, Bobby Jones here from MeidasTouch and Valid Media Networks. A recently released poll reveals America's mood. Roughly 1/3 of Americans say politics and government are the biggest problems facing the country. In Gallup's most recent U.S. tracking entry in early 2026, concerns about government dysfunction remains consistently above 30%, far outpacing traditional anxieties like inflation, crime, or foreign policy. In Gallup's March 2025 survey, 27% of Americans named government or poor leadership as the nation's top problem. Compare that to 2026 follow-up tracking, and it shows that the concern has not receded, even as inflation has cooled and unemployment remained historically low. Instead, dissatisfaction with government has hardened into structural concern, not a cyclical one. Gallup's international comparisons reinforce this point. The United States remains a clear outlier among advanced democracies. Where the median share citing politics as a top national problem is closer to 14%, less than half of what the United States level is. This is a significant warning. Historically, Americans rarely name government itself as the country's central problem. Gallup's long-running, most important problem series shows that for decades, top concerns were economic downturns, wars, and social crisis. Government dysfunction only surged under extraordinary conditions. The most notable historical parallel came during Watergate, when in May and June of 1974, 26% of Americans identified government as the nation's biggest problem. That level was considered shocking at the time. During the McCarthy era in 1954, amid fears of communist infiltration, only about 19% blamed the government. And that was still shocking. The next major surge did not come until the Trump presidency. In February 2019, concern about government peaked at 35%, the highest level Gallup had ever recorded. That period coincided with repeated government shutdowns, norm-breaking behavior from the White House, attacks on the press, and escalating institutional conflict. Outside of those moments, dissatisfaction with government typically lingered in the low teens, overshadowed by economic or security crisis. Gallup's own historical analysis notes that government dysfunction did not become a persistent top-tier concern until after 2012, when polarization intensified and trust in institutions began a steady decline. Since then, government has remained a top 2 issue in most years, a pattern that continues into 2026. What we are witnessing now is historically rare. Americans are naming Washington itself as the source of national decline at levels seen only during Watergate and the first Trump era. But unlike those moments, the concern is no longer spiking and receding, it's staying. So why is this happening now? Researchers and political scientists increasingly point to the Trump effect combined with deepening partisan rage. Gallup's qualitative analysis of open-ended responses shows a stark partisan divide in how Americans interpret government failure. Democratic respondents who cite government as the top problem overwhelmingly frame it as a crisis of democratic erosion. They point to authoritarian tendencies, election denials, attacks on independent institutions, and the normalization of political violence, with Donald Trump serving as the central symbol of that threat. Republican respondents, by contrast, focus on distrust of Democrats, perceptions of corruption, cultural displacement, and fears about America's global standing. While the villains differ, the conclusion is still the same. The system is not working. AP News reporting in 2025 and 2026 places this cynicism in a broader context. After decades of polarization, the Trump presidency, the January 6th insurrection, and ongoing election denialism, Americans across the spectrum increasingly view government not as a problem solver, but as a destabilizing force. That erosion of trust is now measurable. Who blames Washington most often depends on who holds power. In 2022, when Democrats controlled the White House and Congress, Republicans were significantly more likely than Democrats or independents to name government as the nation's biggest problem. Gallup documented that pattern very clearly. By spring of 2025 and into 2026, with Republicans controlling key levers of government, the pattern flipped. Gallup found that around 40% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents cited government or leadership as the top national issue, compared with roughly 17% of Republicans. Independents consistently fall between the two parties. So the lesson is uncomfortable, but very crystal and very clear. Americans tend to view government failure through a partisan lens. When your party loses power, faith in institutions collapse faster. That dynamic itself feeds the cycle of distrust and ensures that dissatisfaction never fully and truly resets. As the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, the implications of this data are profound. Trust in government is not just low, it's at the bottom of the barrel. Pew Research shows that only 17% of Americans trust the federal government to do what is right most of the time, a figure that has barely budged in 2026. Additional Pew surveys find that more than 6 in 10 Americans are dissatisfied with how democracy is working, and over 80% believe elected officials do not care what people like them think. These numbers cut across party lines. International comparisons are equally sobering. The U.S. ranks near the top of wealthy democracies for polarization and social fragmentation. Nearly 9 in 10 Americans agree there are strong conflicts between Republicans and Democrats. Comparative research consistently shows Americans are more anxious about their political system than citizens of peer nations. This has consequences. When institutional trust collapses, civic participation weakens, misinformation spreads faster, and political violence becomes easier to justify. Gallup data has long shown that trust in government rises and falls depending on who controls power, reinforcing zero-sum politics. Pew Research also shows that younger Americans, already facing unprecedented economic headwinds, feel particularly alienated from political systems that they view as unresponsive and captured and controlled by elites. So America, we're at an inflection point. Gallup's most important problem question has historically been predictive. The party seen as better equipped to handle the top issues often wins national elections. But this moment is bigger than just simple electoral math. A sustained belief that government itself is the nation's core problem is exactly the condition under which authoritarian movements thrive. When democracy is perceived as broken, anti-democratic solutions become easier to sell. Americans themselves are offering a roadmap out. Pew Research shows that when asked how democracy could be improved, respondents most often point to structural reform. Government reform ranks above even the call for new leaders. Proposals such as term limits, reducing the influence of money in politics, and reforming electoral structures consistently poll as popular across all parties. The data is unmistakable. 1 in 3 Americans now see government itself as the nation's greatest problem. a level of distrust reached only during the gravest democratic crisis of the past 100 years. And as America approaches 250 years, this is not the moment for complacency, but rather for action. If democracy is to be celebrated rather than feared at this milestone, leaders who claim to defend it must move beyond rhetoric and deliver real institutional reform. Because anniversaries are meant to mark endurance and renewal, not the decline of a once great nation.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.